Greetings. Greetings from Bangkok, where I'm currently attending the first UNESCO regional meeting linked to Education 2030, the education goal within the SDGs. Let me thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts on the two key education initiatives, namely Education for Sustainable Development, ESD, and Global Citizenship Education, GCED. Let me begin by sharing a story that had shaped my thinking about the topic I had been asked to speak today on, aligning ESD and GCE, essential to achieving the education goal of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. During the World Conference on ESD that concluded the decade of ESD in November 2014 in Nagoya, Japan, UNESCO made an ongoing commitment to continue and advance the practice of ESD through the Global Action Program, or GAP. The GAP committed to contributing and aligning to the SDGs and to strengthen education and learning in all agenda, programs, and activities to promote sustainable development. However, as the applause in Nagoya faded, I found myself in conversation with colleagues who mentioned that some participants expressed concern of how the two UN programs, namely ESD and GCED, would fare in a period of declining resources and competing priorities. These questions were not new, because even when ESD was launched in 2005, some education advocates expressed concern that ESD would siphon the limited funds away from EFA and the Millennium Development Goals. However, I will argue that in fact, there is greater alignment than competition between ESD and GCED. The perception of competition comes from our own difficulty of working in partnership with each other, which I would further argue is an area of learning or unlearning for ourselves as ESD and GCE advocates and practitioners. I will make 3 points. First, both ESD and GCED share an understanding of the urgent, complex, and interrelated world that we live in. They both also share a view that education has a key role in addressing these problems, and more importantly, in contributing to achieve the vision of a more sustainable, just, and equitable future. ESD arose from two distinct priorities of the United Nations, namely education and sustainable development. The decade was actually born in 2002, an outcome of the Johannesburg World Summit on Education for Sustainable Development, or the World Summit on Sustainable Development rather, which aimed to integrate the principles, values, and practices of sustainable development in all aspects of education and learning. Global citizenship, on the other hand, is one of the pillars of the UN Secretary-General's Education First Initiative, or GEFI, which was launched in 2012. GEFI describes the context and purpose of GCED as recognizing that it's not enough for education to produce individuals who can read and write and count, but rather education must be transformative and bring shared values to life. Therefore, both education initiatives are clearly much more aligned in terms of having holistic analysis of the context and a commitment to quality education. Now actually both even share something more together because they're actually both identified in Target 4.7 of the new education goal, which states that by 2030, we need to ensure that all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender, equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. However, as I would argue, alignment of context and purpose alone is not sufficient to result in collaboration for quality education and lifelong learning for sustainable development. My second argument is, can we actually work in partnership to achieve the purposes and address the contextual issues that we have identified? If we are to look at the previous experience of EFA, Education for All, and ESD, then I think cross-sectoral and cross-initiative partnerships are more easier to say than do. The DSD, the decade, actually strongly endorsed the need to establish links across these educational initiatives. More specifically, the DESD actually said that the MDG process, the EFA movement, and even the United Nations Literacy Decade have close links with aspects of DESD. All agree on the central importance of basic education and the need to extend and enhance its quality. However, one can easily count the number of times that EFA and ESD are identified together in the last decade. In fact, there is only one document that UNESCO published entitled EFA-ESD Dialogue, Educating for a Sustainable World in 2008. Plus, there was only one workshop in the 2009 mid-decade for the World Congress on ESD in Bonn, Germany, and actually no EFA-ESD workshop at the World Conference in Nagoya that I talked about earlier. Clearly, despite the conceptual alignment and the strong endorsement for cross-sectoral or cross-initiative partnerships, why do we still have concerns about education initiatives being competitive? Mochizuki-san attributed this lack of synergy to stakeholders assuming a dichotomy between EFA and ESD. She argued that to address this, we should go beyond the traditional ESD-EFA dialogue and start articulating education as a critical lever for realizing more resilient, equitable, and sustainable societies. This EFA-ESD dichotomy can be observed not just within UNESCO, not just within the UN agencies, but even with a lot of civil society organizations that I work with. Limited resources, tendering for processes have resulted in organizations competing with each other. Thirdly, I would argue that establishing and nurturing partnerships requires a shift in how we conduct and manage global education initiatives. This is very often different from the way we characterize and conduct what we call quality education and lifelong learning. For example, ESD states that we should use a variety of pedagogical techniques that promote participatory learning and higher order thinking skills. GCED similarly values a learning process focusing not only on what students learn, but also on how they learn, encouraging active and participatory roles. Clearly, both of them value participation. So again, where is the problem? It is not enough to advocate for participatory education without actually embedding participatory approaches in the way we conduct and manage education initiatives. I'd like to talk about one attempt that we did through the Asia Pacific Cultural Center of UNESCO. We had an ACCU ESD project that we wanted to develop a participatory monitoring and evaluation framework in response to the commitment of ESD to contribute to not just transforming the educational paradigm, but also transforming the way that ESD itself is evaluated. Therefore, we developed what we called the HOPE framework. HOPE as an acronym to mean holistic, ownership-based, participatory, partnership, and empowering. And it recognized that HOPE is a framework both as pedagogy and for evaluation of ESD. The aim of the proponents of HOPE was to influence how ESD is evaluated, in particular to challenge how recent ESD evaluations tended to be conducted using logical frameworks. As Nagata-san, a co-worker, argued, one therefore worries that most of the realities of the lives that people are creating is being lost at the evaluation stage because it cannot be logically divided into parts, and that one is losing the kind of qualitative feelings around projects. An extension of this participatory argument that we make is that we are all co-participants and co-learners in this process. Therefore, participatory evaluation should not be limited to evaluating the learning outcomes for learners, but should also include organizational learning and how we structure our organizations. Let me share one more story. As part of the HOPE ESD project, we would travel to project sites to conduct this participatory evaluation. One such project site I visited myself was in Bhutan. As we arrived in the community, the women learners were there to welcome us. They were ready to identify and demonstrate what they had learned through this innovative literacy project, where they did not only improve reading and writing skills, but also they were able to select for themselves what agricultural products they should plant based on using a situational analysis tool that embedded both literacy and numeracy skills. After the successful presentation of these confident women learners, we were curious about what the ESD project meant for those who actually conducted the project. With some prompting, the process of developing a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Agriculture to help with the development of the situational analysis tool was identified as a significant output of the project. In fact, the project facilitator, later in that session, actually said that there are two ways of learning that happen. They share agricultural knowledge with me, and I share that of literacy with them. This is both ways learning, or bidirectional learning. We emphasize to them that both the learning and the partnership itself between the MOE, Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Agriculture were significant outcomes. This kind of outcome is often missed when the focus is only on the outcomes for the learners. This experience has helped to illustrate that while institutions that fund and manage education initiatives will continue to measure impact from the perspective of the outcomes of the learner, we need to be reminded that we are all co-learners and co-participants in shaping a more sustainable future, and that our learning, or sometimes our unlearning, as project implementers are also valued, or rather they also need to be valued. So therefore, in conclusion, I have attempted to illustrate that at the heart of the concern around limited resources for both ESD and GCED is actually a more institutional baggage that we need to recognize and address. I have argued that there is a very strong contextual and conceptual alignment between ESD and GCED. I have demonstrated that there is also very strong endorsement for the need for cross-sectoral or cross-initiative partnerships in conducting ESD and GCED. However, these educational initiatives require that we ourselves as educators, advocates, project managers, and policymakers need to unlearn or learn how we actually engage in participation and in partnership with each other. The context of limited resources, institutional mandates, and the urgency for action does not make it any easier. However, if we are committed to long-term sustainable change, we need to continue to critically reflect and transform ourselves, our practice, and our very institutions if we have any chance of achieving active global citizenship and a sustainable future through quality education and lifelong learning for all, to ensure that no one is left behind, ourselves included. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm sorry I will miss the interaction, but I also have to present at the very same time at this UNESCO meeting I'm attending. All the best, and I challenge you all, learn on.